Good afternoon. Welcome to the New Haven Museum. I'm Margaret Antokashevsky, Executive Director, and it's an honor to welcome you to today's program, Trailblazing Jewish Women from New Haven, which is the first annual Judith and Schiff Women's History program. The museum is a vibrant center for exploring the people, places, events, and ideas that have shaped and continue to define the Elm City, and highlighting women's achievements, not just during March, but year-round, has been a focus of our work as we look for ways to engage women as artists, guest curators, designers, and collaborators, give voice to their stories and lived experiences, and seek greater representation of women in our collections. The exhibit on view in the auditorium here, Trailblazer, Connecticut Jewish Women Making History from the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford, follows other recent exhibits and programs centering women, from the artist of the New Haven Paint and Clay Club to the work must be done, women of color and the right to vote before COVID, to instance Linda Lindbrock's Polaroid portraits, which is currently on view. Our Whitney Library holds a number of collections from women's organizations and women's papers, most notably the recent gift of independent historian Doris B. Townsend's personal papers. The second half of today's program is dedicated and devoted to Judith Schiff, city historian, who was a trailblazer in her own right, as you will soon hear. Judy was a longtime member of the museum and served as our secretary. She was our 150th anniversary annual meeting speaker. She guest curated an exhibit on the 90th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and more recently, she coordinated a panel discussion on the women buried in Grove Street Cemetery. One of those speakers, her good friend Vera Wells, is with us today. Judy was a generous friend, supportive of me and our staff, our go-to source for local history, and always a phone call away. We're delighted to have with us today Elizabeth Rose, Executive Director of the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford. I first met Elizabeth when she was Library Director at the Fairfield Museum, which she left in 2020 for her current position. Elizabeth contacted me last summer to tell me about the Trailblazer exhibit and to see if we would like to host it, as at least 3 of the women highlighted had local connections. Elizabeth agreed that it was a good opportunity to co-present a program during this time with our own Jewish Historical Society of Greater New Haven, of which Judy was a founding member, and we're grateful to them and their archivist, Jacob Griffith Rosenberger, for the tribute exhibit downstairs in the lobby in today's program. Elizabeth Rose holds a PhD in Women's History and U.S. History from Rutgers University, and she has written 2 books on the history of childcare. She also produced a guide to the women's resources in our Whitney Library, which we continue to add to. We'll have time for questions at the end of the presentations, and then refreshments in the lobby. Welcome, Elizabeth Rose.
Thank you so much. It's great to see so many of you here to celebrate Women's History Month with us and to learn more about some of Connecticut's pioneering Jewish women. This exhibit, which was developed by the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Hartford in 2019, highlights 12 Jewish women from Connecticut who achieved remarkable things in their public lives and whose work made a lasting impact in different areas. In addition to the ones I'm about to talk about, that also includes in education, labor activism, and writing, and you can learn more about those milling around the room later on. These women that we selected for this exhibit came of age in different generations. They came from somewhat different backgrounds and had different relationships to Jewish identity, religion, and peoplehood. But each of them showed grit and determination to overcome the obstacles that they faced, to innovate in the field in which they were working, and left a legacy for us to follow. I'm going to start with very brief comments about 2 of perhaps the most well-known women represented in the exhibit, who both have ties to the Hartford area, before I get into the New Haven women that will be the primary focus. But we couldn't go without talking about Sophie Tucker or talking about Beatrice Fox Auerbach. So, Sophie Tucker, a legendary entertainer, settled in Hartford with her family as a child. They were immigrants from the Ukraine, and her parents ran a kosher restaurant down in the Front Street neighborhood, which was the Hartford's immigrant neighborhood. And Sophie worked in the restaurant with her family, and she got her start by singing for the customers in the restaurant. When she was a teenager, she ran off to seek her fortune on New York's vaudeville stage, and she went on to have a remarkably long and successful performing career, shifting with the times in almost every genre of entertainment that went through that period of time, from vaudeville to Broadway, to jazz clubs, to radio, to television and film. She toured internationally and was a particular hit in England, where she performed for the Queen on several different occasions. Sophie became best known for performances that expressed her humorous and frank approach to sexuality. She called herself the last of the red hot mamas, and she embraced that. As a larger woman, she had trouble initially kind of breaking into show business because she didn't have the body that was the expected ideal, but she made that into her own brand and her own way of presenting herself and connecting with audiences. Beatrice Fox Auerbach was born just a few years later than Tucker into much more privileged circumstances. Her family were the founders of the G. Fox department store in Hartford and had been in Hartford already for 2 generations at the time that she was born. She ended up taking over as president of the department store in 1938 following the death of her husband and then her father, whom she worked besides. And of course, it was quite unusual at that time for a woman to be the head of a major corporation, but she soon gained respect for her professional instincts, and under her leadership, G. Fox became the largest privately owned department store in the United States, and as you may know, a landmark in downtown Hartford. She understood that customers wanted the retail experience to be an event in itself and a destination, and G. Fox was definitely that destination in Hartford. 2 other things I want to mention briefly about her: that she was especially noted for her new and progressive policies with her employees, including retirement packages, hiring, pension, that kind of thing, but also interest in promoting and opening up managerial jobs to African Americans in the department store, which was quite unusual for that time. And she also was very interested in training women to succeed in business and to succeed in their nonprofit organizational life. And she created what she called the Service Bureau for Women's Organizations, which helped to train women as how to run meetings, how to give speeches, all the things that help organizations to thrive, and also to learn about national and international issues. She became friendly through that with Eleanor Roosevelt, and they had quite a bit in common and interests in common, and worked together in some interesting ways. So, 2 of our Hartford women very briefly, and then I'm gonna start by speaking about Annie Albers, one of our New Haven women. Annie Albers was born in Berlin and came of age there in the 1920s, which, as you may know, is a time of modernism and a lot of explosion of culture in Berlin. She wanted to study at the Bauhaus, which was the school that was sort of known for expressing modernist art forms. Because she was a woman, she was not permitted to study what she wanted to study, which was sculpture. So you may know that sculpture is a particularly difficult field for women to break into, but she was told she could study weaving. So weaving was not what she had in mind, but after taking a class with expressionist artist Paul Klee in 1927, he inspired her to push the boundaries of the medium, and she really embraced it in her future work, and she began to see weaving's possibilities as an abstract form. At the Bauhaus, for instance, she started experimenting with different materials, including cellophane, which was new at the time, and I had not thought of when cellophane was invented, but enabled her to create weavings that would absorb sound and reflect light in interesting ways. She spent extensive time studying traditional weaving techniques in parts of South America and Mexico, and those techniques informed a lot of her work as well. She and her husband, the artist Joseph Albers, fled from Nazi Germany in 1933 and found a home at the experimental Black Mountain College in North Carolina, where they started the art program there. And then later, they moved here to New Haven when Joseph was teaching at Yale and spent a large part of their lives here as well. Annie had the first solo show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1949 by a textile artist, so that gives you a sense of how she pushed the form of that art form that didn't get a huge amount of respect and that she was sort of pushed into because of her gender. So I think this is a really interesting quote here. To work with thread seemed sissy to me. I wanted something to be conquered, but circumstances held me to threads and they won me over. So very interesting career path, and one that you see often in women's history, where women are perhaps relegated to a certain area but figure out ways to push the boundaries of that to do what it is that they want to do. Later in her life, she shifted focus to creating reproducible fabrics, to printmaking and works on paper. And she wrote a book called On Weaving, published in '65, which helped to establish design studies as an area of academic and aesthetic inquiry. Next woman I want to talk about is Ellen Ash Peters. She is known for becoming the first female justice on Connecticut State Supreme Court, and then became the first female Chief Justice of that court. She was also a refugee from Nazi Germany, coming with her family here in 1938 at the age of 8. And she spoke about how her memories of that horrific era influenced her determination to uphold individual rights as a judge. 2 years after graduating from Yale Law School, she was appointed as the first woman appointed to its faculty, which I have to think is a remarkable achievement and a remarkable indication of her abilities. And when she was tenured in 1964, she became the school's first tenured female professor, and then became the first woman honored with a named professorship. She was appointed to the State Supreme Court in 1978 and became the Chief Justice in 1984, the highest position in the state's judiciary. She presided over several important state constitutional decisions, as well as opening up new court facilities. Notably, she wrote the 4-3 decision in the landmark Schiff versus O'Neill case, which affected school desegregation issues in the Hartford area. Last person I want to speak about right now is Florence Wald, who is a pioneer of hospice in the United States. Raised in New York, she attended Mount Holyoke College, as did several other of these women actually, and received a master's degree from Yale School of Nursing in 1941. She returned to Yale as the director of the Mental Health and Psychiatric Nursing Program and became an associate professor and later the first Jewish dean of the nursing school. While she was here at Yale in 1965, she heard a talk by the British hospice pioneer Cicely Saunders about managing the pain of the terminally ill, and that really inspired Florence Wald to bring hospice care to the United States. She had from a child been instilled with social justice values from her parents, and she was already somewhat frustrated working within the medical profession that often overlooked a person's comfort in the search for a sometimes non-existent cure. She had already been concerned with end-of-life care reform, but did not know that there were others who shared her concerns. So at first she worked to reform the curriculum at Yale to incorporate end-of-life care. But merely reforming the academic curriculum did not satisfy her desire to change her profession, and in '68 she resigned from the deanship in order to study the British approach to care for the terminally ill. And 6 years later she established Hospice Inc., the country's first hospice care facility here in Branford. Her approach crossed established boundaries of medical research, causing friction in the medical community, which is a nice way of saying that a lot of times doctors did not appreciate a nurse telling them what to do. At that time in the early 70s, she remembered people often wouldn't even say the word cancer out loud. There were those who feared that it was contagious, that were afraid of being too close to those who had it. Sometimes doctors didn't even tell patients or families what the prognosis was or the course of the disease. Weld carved out an integral role for nurses in patient care, challenging the hierarchy which placed doctors as supreme authority. So a little bit like Annie Albert, she's working within a female-dominated profession, but she's really pushing at the boundaries of what that could be. She believed sincerely in the importance of patient autonomy in their care and felt that dying patients' physical, emotional, and spiritual needs were all of equal importance. She was promoted to full professor, maintaining her connection at Yale in 1980, while continuing to change the way doctors and medical practitioners approach palliative care. Later in her life, she devoted a lot of her effort to setting up hospice units in American prisons. So she's really remembered as the mother of the hospice movement in the United States and really changed end-of-life care across the country. So looking at these three women, we see that all of them have a connection to Yale, and obviously Yale is a magnet for them and their career trajectories and the work that they did. I'm sure that there are only some of the many Jewish women from New Haven whose stories deserve to be better known and have helped to make history. And I'd reinforce what Margaret Ann said, that we don't just want to do this during Women's History Month, but all year long, to be looking for the stories of all kinds of women from all kinds of different backgrounds. So with that, I will pass it on to the speakers about Judith Schiff, who's one of the trailblazing women we're talking about here today, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about these women afterwards.
This is about the right height for me. I'm Rhoda Zeller-Samuel. I got to know Judy Schiff 20 years ago when I became a board member of the Jewish Historical Society of Greater New Haven, and she became a mentor and friend throughout the rest of her life to me. First, I'd like to thank the New Haven Museum for inviting us to be part of this program. Thank you, Margaret Ann, and thank you, Elizabeth Rose, for agreeing to participate with us in this program. And I want to thank our committee that has worked really hard over the last few months to put this program together. Could the committee members please stand up so that everybody can see who you are? And I would like to give some special recognition to Carol Bass, who wrote the beautiful piece about Judy that I hope you picked up downstairs, and to one of our archivists at the Jewish Historical Society, Jacob Griffith Rosenberger, who is in the back, who arranged the exhibit downstairs. And Jacob just handed me a note that Annie Albers created a series of prints for the Jewish Home for the Aged in New Haven as a fundraiser, which were sold after the home closed to fund a grant that the Jewish Foundation gave to the Jewish Historical Society and enabled us to hire Jake as our archivist. So there is a connection here. And I also have a very personal connection to G. Fox and Company in Hartford. I grew up in West Hartford, and it was where everybody shopped. I used to have jobs working at G. Fox and Company during my spring vacations when I was in college. And of course, I ended up spending more money than I earned there. And junior sportswear, that was the department. And Louis Fox, who was a member of the Fox family, was my Sunday school teacher. So I have a lot of connections, and thank you for mentioning those. Judy Schiff was my friend and mentor. She passed away 8 months ago on July 11th at the age of 84. We are honoring her today with this first Judy Schiff Women's History Month program. She was clearly a trailblazer. She worked for over 60 years as a Yale research archivist and preserved and shared Black history, ethnic history, women's history, and local history. She volunteered extensively in our community as a founder and leader of the Jewish Historical Society back in 1976, along with other founders Harvey Layden, Rabbi Arthur Cheel, and Professor Roland Osterweiss, and as a founder of the Ethnic Heritage Center, of which the Jewish Historical Society shares space and is part, on the campus of Southern Connecticut State University in 1988, and as New Haven's city historian from 2012 to 2022. She served on numerous community boards. In recognition for her work, she received the inaugural Edward A. Boucher Society Legacy Award in 2011. The award presentation took place at Howard University and was made by Yale professor Curtis Patton. Judy had researched the life of Boucher, who was a New Haven-born physicist and educator, and was the first African-American to earn a PhD from any American university, completing his dissertation in physics at Yale in 1876. It is my understanding that the African-American playwright Calvin Alexander Ramsey is currently writing a play about Boucher's life using Judy's research. She was also honored with an Ivy Award for contributing to increased understanding and cooperation between Yale and the city of New Haven. As a founder and consultant to the Ethnic Heritage Center, Yale actually loaned her to the Ethnic Heritage Center societies to help them do what they needed to do to become incorporated and form the Ethnic Heritage Center. As Catherine will describe in a few minutes, she also received the Linda Lorimer Award and the Yale Medal for her service to the Yale and university and alumni communities. She served as president of the New Haven League of Women Voters and the Yale University Women's Organization. She was founder and president of the New England Archivists and served on the governing boards of the New Haven Museum, the Grove Street Cemetery, and University Towers Co-ops, where she lived. I'm sure there was more. I hope you read Carol's excellent overview for more details. Judy continued to support the work of the Jewish Historical Society and Ethnic Heritage Center throughout her life. I was calling her every few months, even during COVID, even when her health was failing. She taught our Ethnic Historical Society boards how to create an acquisition policy, how to protect our special documents with acid-free paper and climate-controlled space. Just last year, Judy nominated the Ethnic Heritage Center's Walk New Haven project for an award from Connecticut Magazine, which was having its 20th anniversary. We received the award and were featured in 2 issues of Connecticut Explored magazine as a result. Judy read and commented on the historical accuracy of the texts for our Walk New Haven publications. When we got stuck in our research, we would ask Judy, and she always had an answer. For example, we were trying to find a historic picture of the New Haven Boys Club, and Judy found a Library of Congress picture of boys playing pool in 1909 at the first New Haven Boys Club. Before COVID, we had lunch together a few times a year, often at Yorkside Pizza, which was right across from an entrance to the library, so it was convenient. She always shared her amazing stories about her research and Yale's special committee work, such as helping to plan the 300th anniversary celebration of Yale's move from Saybrook to New Haven in 1760. During one of our lunches, she told me she had been collecting information about important women of Yale and the city and hoped to use the material to write a book in her retirement. As we know, she did not retire. Now we want to continue some of this work by honoring her and other trailblazing women who helped shape our communities. This is our start. We welcome your help in planning future Judith and Schiff Women's History programs. Now I'd like to introduce 3 people who knew her very well, who will share some of their stories. Catherine Lassala, who graduated from Yale in '81, a close friend and colleague, editor of Yale Alumni magazine since 2003, where Judy wrote the popular Old Yale column for over 20 years. Then, two people who are family. Sarah Frame is the daughter of Jessie, Judy's best friend since grade school. Sarah and her siblings, and now their children, considered Aunt Judy as an always present and loving figure in their lives. Thanks to Sarah for sharing many of the items in our display case downstairs. Like her cousin, Sarah, Rachel Leff is a lifelong friend of Judy's and also considers her as an aunt. Rachel always admired Judy's work and followed in her footsteps, attending Barnard College and becoming a librarian. So.
You have to bear with me for a minute because these are very important artifacts. Literally. So hello everyone, and thank you for coming to this day when we're remembering Judy Schiff. She was born in Manhattan in 1937, but she lived in New Haven almost all her life. She received her history degree, as you just learned, from Barnard College, but hers was in 1959.
Mike, please.
And that was back when.
Thank you.
Okay. Should I start over?
No.
Okay. Fortunately, although women weren't admitted to Yale College then, women were allowed to work at Yale. Hurrah. And Judy started working at the Cowles Foundation for Research in Economics, but she very shortly moved to the Manuscripts and Archives Department in Sterling Library, and she loved it. I think that was just her best place to be. She loved investigating ancient letters and papers. She loved finding interesting pieces of history. She loved connecting all the dots. Eventually, she became the chief research archivist of the Yale University Library, and she truly deserved that title because she never stopped researching. Right here, I have this was not in my text, but I'm just going to show you the green guide. This is your moment. This is your interval for looking at things. So Judy, at one point, had to have surgery, and it was pretty difficult surgery. And she was lying on her hospital bed when Linda Lorimer, who was a great personage at the university and had many different places to take, and she was at some point everywhere, and it seemed like she was all over the campus. And she was very, very proud and fond of Judy, and she brought Judy all the materials she would need in order to provide a green guide, because people were coming to Yale and they needed a green guide. And so Judy was lying on her bed, and I used to think, oh dear, that was terrible, poor Judy. But when you think about Judy, she was always going. She always had ideas. She always wanted to do stuff. So I think Linda did the right thing there. Then moving on, I was not the one who discovered Judy Schiff or the old Yale columns. That credit belongs to my predecessor at the Yale Alumni Magazine, Carter Wiseman. So Judy would, she would write a piece, and we'd have one page with a picture. And the very first one Mark Branch of our office looked through the library to find it. And it was from March 1987, a Dickensian delight. And Judy wrote at the ending, in March of 1868, during the lecture tour of the United States, Charles Dickens proclaimed Hill House Avenue to be the most beautiful street in America. By the early 20th century, the character of the lower block succumbed to institutional buildings and the elms to disease. But new trees had been planted, and by concentrating on the upper block, a portrait of the days of calling cards and carriages can still be evoked. And that's just such a lovely piece of writing. She never stopped writing those pieces for the magazine until she was too sick to work, and we miss them. I wrote a column about her for the Yale Alumni magazine in 2004. One of my friends, who was one of Judy's great friends and is here today, Richard Nash Gould, had found an old photograph. It showed that one of Yale's quadrangles, back in its earlier days, was paved with rough stone blocks, sort of this high and rectangular. They were very different from the paving we have there now. So where had they come from? And he suggested some possibilities. Could those blocks have been ballast for ancient ships? Could those blocks have come from World War I battlefields? So we went to Judy. And she went into the archives. And she found the 1928 statement. Okay. Talk closer, okay. All right, I'm talking closer. She found a 1928 statement from the Yale treasurer. She knew those archives inside and out. It verified that the blocks were completely ordinary, delivered by a local contractor in New Haven, who had sent them to Yale for a payment of $5,650. So we didn't find anything mysterious. But my comment about Judy in that column where I wrote this up was, any unanswered question about Yale's past finds its way to her. And I had only been there for a year, but I could tell. That was true for New Haven too, when a tree in the green fell over and 18th century human bones were exposed. Judy was called in to the group of people who were examining them. When workers digging up the street found a long brick wall under a sidewalk, Judy was called in. She identified it as a 200-year-old cistern for fighting fires. And there are just innumerable times when someone needed Judy's help. She worked with me on the magazine for almost 2 decades. She always had an idea or 2 or 3 just ready to go, and we discussed them, and sometimes in one decade to another, which is very smart because you can't really engage people and get them hooked if you're stuck on the early 1800s and you never go out. And to Judy's honor, although we sometimes get compliments for our work at the magazine, very many of those compliments were for old Yale. She often described people who had broken the barriers. There was James Pennington, the first Black person known to attend any class at Yale University. He was refused matriculation or a degree, but he was allowed to audit classes at the Divinity School. He attended them from 1835 to 1839, and after 5 years he was ready for ordination. There was the first Black person to enroll in Yale College, the brilliant Edward Boucher, and you've already heard about him. And then this one is great. In 1885, Alice Ruthie Blake Jordan got into Yale's all-male Yale School by using her initials instead of her first name. She was admitted. She was an excellent budding lawyer, and she won the argument. But the Yale Law School wrote a rule banning women after that. It only lasted until 1919, so these are just a very few examples of Judy's work. And I'm sure nobody now knows as much as Judy did about New Haven and its history. But if you're interested, you can go to our website and see her work. It's yalealumnimagazine.org. And just search Old Yale and you'll find lots and lots to read. Judy and I used to talk on the phone a lot. We'd sometimes talk after the workday was done, and she'd tell me about her latest find or a historical puzzle she hadn't quite figured out yet. It was really enjoyable. It was great. But one evening on the phone, just a few years ago, she said she wished that Yale would grant her a diploma. That was and still is a thing at Yale. A new professor who does not have a Yale diploma will be given an honorary Yale diploma. But her wish really troubled me because all of a sudden I realized she had not been given her due. She worked so hard. She had unearthed so many finds and stories. She was an expert on New Haven's past and Yale's past, and possibly the expert. And she absolutely deserved the honor. So I called up Linda Lorimer, who served at Yale in many important positions, as I mentioned, and who was one of Judy's top fans. And I was ready to go out and get that diploma immediately. But Linda explained that Yale would never give it. Those diplomas were reserved for professors. The best thing, she said, was there were two things. One, Linda would hold a party and give Judy an LKL award for her knowledge and for her willingness to spread knowledge. And she did. LKL awards are given every year to a few staff members. That year, Linda held a party at her own house, and the finale was Linda's speech honoring Judy, and it was great. It was also very long. Because there's so much you need to say about Judy. And Linda, the other thing Linda said to me on the phone that night was that I should try to get Judy the Yale Medal. The Yale Medal is a very important honor at Yale. It's huge. And it's given every year to 4 or 5 people who have done great and memorable work for Yale. But it was almost always distributed only to Yale alumni. So I went on a campaign. I wrote up everything I could think of about Judy's work and importance to Yale, according to the rules given for Yale medals, including that the person being written about can't know they're being written about. So Judy didn't know any of it. I had a dozen important Yale people sign on to the request. I sent it to the committee. I was sure she would be accepted, but she wasn't. So next year I tried again. I asked for advice from Mark Branch, who I worked with at Yale. He said, well, what about adding some person to your list who is really, really important? So I called Richard Nash Gould, who is a good friend of Ed Bass, who is a generous donor to the university, and he joined. I wrote up the request, again, trying to make it as clear and emphatic as I could. Schiff was a Yale gem, and that time it worked. And I really did cry tears of joy. I used to have lunch with Judy at Maury's, the old restaurant on New York Street, and I still think of her sitting there across the table from me. She just seemed to belong to Yale and to New Haven, and I miss her. You often hear about how privileged people at Yale are. In Judy's case, it was Yale that was privileged to have Judy. Thank you. This is Judy's, because because she got that award, because she was accepted, she received this award.
Before Sarah and Rachel share their memories, I just want to acknowledge the president and vice president of the Jewish Historical Society, Marjorie Drucker, Michael Dimmenstein, for all of your support of the entire board. Marjorie's right here. Want to stand up again? And the planning committee, the program committee for your wonderful help and support in putting this program together. And now we'll hear from family, from Sarah and Rachel.
That's very difficult to follow that. Thank you. So we're going to switch gears a bit here. There's definitely no shortage of professional accolades that Judy could get, but I had the opportunity to know an entirely different Judy than many of you here. And I don't remember a time in my life that Judy was not present. She would come and visit for days at a time. She'd stay in my room with me. Judy was at every holiday. She was at our bar mitzvahs, our weddings, our children's birthdays. Anything and everything that meant something, Judy was there, just like an aunt. We saw her whenever we went to New Haven to visit my grandmother or our cousins. She and my mother were so close that when it was time for my grandmother to move out of her home, she moved to University Towers to be closer to Judy and her mother, Lucille. And the four of them were best friends. They played bridge together regularly. My grandmother lived on the 4th floor, Judy on the 12th, which, by the way, still has some of the best views that New Haven has to offer. And I remember racing with my brothers between the floors, taking turns, who got to take the elevator, who got to run the stairs. I'm sure we were just awful for everybody that was there. But to this day, you know, I still spend time in Judy's apartment, gathering things and trying to pull things together. And I still, every time I go out on her balcony, it's just, it brings back so many memories. I recently found a picture of my mother and Judy from about 40 years ago, and they were just sitting on the balcony all dressed up. I don't know what they were doing, but they seemed very happy. And as an adult, I loved taking my own kids to New Haven to visit Judy for weekends, especially if my husband was traveling. We could sneak off and take my mom, and we'd stay at her apartment, and they did exactly the same things that we did when we were young. They raised the floors, they sat on the balcony, they swim in the pool. There's a community room that I just found out they can't use anymore, but that was one of my kids' favorite places, and Judy loved showing them. And she would talk all about the history of University Towers. And then we would always take a trip through Yale, always to the library. They'd get to visit her office, and then buy books at Atticus. I also remember Judy taking my two kids, now much older, to the Beinecke, and this is where Judy was just very funny. They decided to run around. They played hide and go seek in the Beinecke. They hid under the large table that had the Bible. And I was having a heart attack. She thought the entire thing was hysterical. Went downstairs and told everybody that worked at the Beinecke that it was fine. They wouldn't hurt anything, she promised. They didn't, and she loved it. She thought it was a great way to get to know that amazing library. She did often speak of her work at Yale, but never in great detail, at least not that I can recall. It was more often she would just weave facts about Yale and New Haven, or my own family, that she knew into just about everything. There was almost no topic that could not somehow be connected back to New Haven or Yale. Last year, when I went to visit her in the hospital, she spent a majority of the time, and I'm talking like 2 hours, talking about William Taft and his connections to Yale Hospital. I walked out knowing more about our 27th president than I ever could have imagined. I was not blind to her brilliance or her amazing work. I knew about her many awards and her recognitions, her invitations to speak at conferences, I knew she counted people such as David McCullough as her friend, but she was so humble. If she spoke about any of them, it was not her participation. It was just the facts surrounding them, such as the research she did to prepare what she learned and what she taught to others. A few years before she passed, she would tell me all about having the opportunity to work with Marta Moret on special projects for Yale. And she especially loved the Women of Yale project. And of course, the culmination of her work, it's been mentioned before already, is when she received the Yale Medal of Honor. It may have been the only time I actually remember her talking about herself and her own achievements. Unfortunately, it was 2020 and it had to be delivered via Zoom. She did talk all about the lovely dinner that would have happened otherwise. But it did mean that she got to invite so many of us to watch and celebrate with her, which was also very, very special. So, with that, I want to thank you all for being here. Judy was just such a huge part of my family, and we love and miss her very much. So, I'm now excited to turn this over to my cousin Rachel, as a librarian and historian herself. She's just much better at tying all of Judy's work and how it impacted us here in this room and beyond.
Thank you. When I read a draft of what Sarah wrote, it actually made me tear up a little. So like Sarah, Judy Schiff was like family to me. And she was also someone whose work and intellect I always admired a great deal. And it's an honor for me to be able to be a part of this tribute today. So much of Judy's work as an archivist and historian was about memory, right? What we remember, how we remember, and who we remember. A lecture series in honor of Judy that focuses on women's history is a perfect tribute. So we've heard a lot about Judy's accomplishments already this afternoon, but I'd like to take a moment to share a few of my memories of her. We all know the ways that Judy was entwined with Yale University, but she also identified with another institution, Barnard College, her alma mater and mine, as was already stated. Over the years, she told me many stories about her time at Barnard, ranging from her studies to picnic bars in the village to many, many things in between. She took advantage of many perks of being an alum, events, lectures, reunions, and when I had my daughter, she sent us a gift of a check, and in the memo field it said, for her Barnard tuition. I think that Judy embodied a lot of the qualities that Barnard aspires to have its students possess. Ever the historian, Judy saw the scope of her time at Barnard as a snapshot of cultural change. She told me about how in her first year there, male guests of students could enter a dorm room only during set hours on Sundays, doors open, 4 feet on the floor. And in her fourth and final year at Barnard, there were no longer any such restrictions at all. So this evidence and encapsulations of cultural shifts were something that Judy could often seem to find. Another example that pops to mind was a time when she offered an explanation of a photo of my grandmother and her mother wearing these little hats that Judy explained were called winsies, and that they were a brief transition between the time when women wore hats and when hats went out of fashion, which, you know, most people looking at a photo like that, that's not really what they would think about, but she was able to pull that together. And just as I followed in Judy's footsteps to Barnard, I also followed in her footsteps to become a librarian. In fact, my decision to pursue a career in libraries was in part inspired by Judy's amazing career. I remember a lovely lunch with her at the Graduate Club, one of her favorite places in New Haven, just as I was finishing my master's, and she told me how much she had loved her life in libraries. She shared that she had no plans really to ever retire. She reasoned that if she retired, she would just simply spend all of her time visiting archives and libraries anyway, so she might as well just keep working. So working in the university library allowed Judy to share what she knew with so many people, whether that knowledge was about the history of women at Yale, or Yale and slavery, or aviation history, or Grove Street Cemetery, or the menu at Maury's, or the history of Jews in New Haven. And she, in fact, told me more about our family's history in New Haven than any members of my family ever did. Yes, as I keep saying, Judy had a commanding knowledge of many things, and she was always happy to share what she knew. But Judy never showed off, and in fact, I would say her knowledge was rivaled only by her humility. She never showed off. In fact, I remember one day, probably 15 years ago or so, I happened to visit the website of the Society of American Artists, and front and center on the homepage was a story about Judy, picture and everything. Then later that day, I was grabbing my mail, and there was a Barnard Alumni magazine, and I opened it up, and sure enough, there was a picture of Judy, and another story about Judy. Totally different topic. So I gave her a call that evening to tell her about my double sighting of her that day, and she just sort of chuckled a little and, sort of said, oh, well, whatever, and quickly moved on to another topic. In many ways, Judy's career was always about service to the community of Yale, the community of New Haven, the community of historians, and importantly, of people whose histories were not recognized properly, whose histories she sometimes excavated. One day this past fall, when Sarah and I were in New Haven Sarah was down to handle some of Judy's affairs, we met up and walked over to the Grove Street Cemetery, another New Haven institution that held great importance for Judy. We went to visit her grave and placed stones on top of her family's gravestone, which most of you probably know is a common Jewish tradition. We added our stones to some that had already been left by someone else. And then we walked over to the marker for the 6 men who had been captives on the Amistad and had died in New Haven in 1839, buried in an unmarked grave in the cemetery. As we know, Judy was instrumental in getting that stone erected. And as we approached, we saw that there were stones on that grave as well. And I imagine that the person who went, sorry, this is terrible. I imagine that the person who went there to remember and honor Judy also remembered and honored those men. And to me, that was such a touching and apt moment. It entwined the remembering of Judy with the remembering of those people whose contributions she worked so hard to honor.
So that was just amazing. Thank you all. So now if you have questions for any of our speakers, it's the time to ask. And we do have a microphone, Patrick. There's a microphone if anybody would like to ask a question or share a reflection with Judy. I know there's many friends in the room. Or even come up here and say a few words. We're happy to have you up here. No questions? All right. As I said, if anybody would like to say a few words at the podium, happily step aside. Okay. If not, again, this has just been an extraordinary program. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you, Elizabeth, for doing this, and Rhoda and everybody else, Jewish Historical Society. We have refreshments downstairs. And have a great rest of your day.